What kind of flavor crack are they smoking? They're not going to get away with a color revolution.
So, ladies and gentlemen, joining me this evening, the great Scott Horton. He's got a new book out called Provoked, How Washington Started the New Cold War with Russia and the Catastrophe with Ukraine. He's been hitting the circuit, just crushing debates everywhere. I saw, even on this Thanksgiving week, I saw you were out there doing yeoman's work with all these warmongers, trying to steer them straight. So, thank you so much for joining us tonight, Mr. Scott Horton.
Thank you so much for having me. Great to be here.
All right, so I do a lot of debates with people, particularly on the Russia-Ukraine stuff, and my first interest really in the region probably came once the impeachment of Trump started to come about, the original one with the the perfect phone call and all of that. One of the things I talk a lot about to people, and I only know a baseline of this, is whether or not the U.S. was involved in a color revolution in Ukraine that resulted in sort of the initial invasion under Obama. Now, I thought maybe that would be a good place to start, because I know you give a huge list of reasons of aggression from the West and the United States in particular. But on that particular issue, when we go back and we look at the ousting of Yanukovych, did the United States actually engage in a color revolution, or was this something sort of organic from the people of Ukraine?
Well, sort of is the key word, right? It's both when you put it that way. So it's the same thing they did 10 years before under W. Bush in the Orange Revolution of 2004. In that case, Yanukovych had supposedly won the election. It was close, and both sides claimed the other side was trying to rig it and so forth. But the American, very well-financed side said, no, see, our exit polls proved that we're the ones who won and you're the one who stole it. And I think there was some evidence of some rigging on the other side as well. But you had the West come in, spend tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions of dollars, and they held a big carnival, essentially this big color revolution, the Orange Revolution, until they could force the Yanukovych to agree to a third round of elections, which was unconstitutional, but he gave in on that, and then he lost on the third round, and the American chosen favorites won. And that was how the Orange Revolution had played out. So now this is 10 years later. The people who had won the Orange Revolution had totally ruined everything and had been discredited and forced out, and Yanukovych had won again. Now, so by the time of, it's Viktor Yanukovych, he's from the Party of Regions, which represented Eastern oligarchs. They would say, oh, that makes him purely a sock puppet of the Kremlin, but that's not exactly true. He's a sock puppet of Eastern oligarchs in Eastern Ukraine, and they have their own relationships with Russia, which are also not completely cut and dry in that manner. In fact, I'll try to remember something smart to say about that in a minute. But anyway, so this guy Yanukovych, he won in 2010, free and fair, no question about it, crushed the American chosen favorites. And then he was the president from 2010 through our controversy, bring us up to date to the Maidan Revolution that you're referring to, the Maidan Revolution that you're referring to in 2014. That brings us up to late 2013, okay? Now, so here's where I'm going to remember to say something smart. I urge you and all of your audience to go and watch, I'm sure you're familiar with the Patrick Bet-David show.
Sure.
Right?
Yep.
Great interviewer, brilliant guy. Okay, he did this interview with Paul Manafort. Now, Manafort, he's partners with Roger Stone. He is a very slick political operator, campaign manager, mostly for foreign thugs and dictators around the global South. Not a very nice guy. He's buddies with Roger Stone, and they're kind of slimy political operator guys. Now, if you listen to the Democrats tell it, which is obviously be false, I already showed right there by saying I'm paraphrasing the Democrats. You know that what I'm about to say is not true when I set it up that way. The Democrats claimed that Paul Manafort was Vladimir Putin's agent who controlled Donald Trump. And because of what a slave of Putin Manafort was, and then he was the agent that they used to control Trump in the Russiagate hoax. Now, I'm sure your audience already would agree with me, but you should know it's just true that Russiagate was an entire hoax before the Ukraine Gate hoax. Thing was entirely fake and false, but that was, part of the setup. Anyway, so just to explain, Manafort's role there, all those assumptions about who he was and what his interests were are wrong. This is where you got to listen to his interview on the Patrick Bet-David show. He would disagree with me a lot about what I'm about to explain about what happened there. He actually sounds just like the Hawks. He sounds like a John McCain guy on Ukraine and Russia. Literally, he sounds just like Michael McFaul or Ann Applebaum or any of the American anti-Russian hawks. And he's very anti-Russia. His job, and honestly, dude, it's not a put on. And you watch this interview, it's 2 hours long or something. He's going off. This is not an act. It's so clear what's happening here, okay? His job working for Yanukovych was to help him move west, to help him join with the European Union, break away from Russian influence. And part of that was those Eastern Ukrainian oligarchs that Yanukovych worked for. You're supposed to be like, oh, Eastern, that means Russian, and just leave it at that. But in fact, Manafort explains that, and I think he's referring to Firtash and some of these others who backed the party regions, they wanted to move west. And the way he explains it was, he says, compared to the actual Russian oligarchs, these Eastern Ukrainian sort of pseudo-Russian oligarchs were always treated like the redheaded stepchild. And were always kind of used and abused and frozen out of good deals and whatever by their Russian better oligarchs, right? And whenever their side loses an election or a fake revolution and pro-Western factions come to power in Kiev, the first thing they do is nationalize their companies and then give them to their friends, which sounds crazy in America. You know, that's not the way it is. In the West, that's not the way it is. That's the way it is over there. You know, Barack Obama wins an election. He nationalizes Citigroup and hands it to his buddy.
Right.
No, wait, actually, Citigroup were Barack Obama's buddies. They're the ones who put him in there. So use a different example.
Right.
Wait. So they were sick and tired of that. And these Eastern oligarchs thought that if they joined with the EU or signed, this is not full membership, but there was an association agreement with the EU, but it means they got to sign up for more and more Western norms and ways of doing things, that if they did that, then that would put an end to their companies being seized and taken away from them and this kind of thing. You just can't do that within the rules of the EU. It's just too blatant kind of corruption. The way they have their own corruption, but not quite as blatant as I seize your company and give it to my brother-in-law, you know, kind of just crazy stuff. So that was why even the Eastern oligarchs, that again, the Democrats would just totally oversimplify and have you believe are all just slaves of Putin and love him. Not even slaves because they love it so much and whatever, but it's just not right, really. And Manafort explains this so well to Patrick Bet-David, what was going on there. So now, bring us back up to November 2013. Manafort is trying to help Yanukovych sign up with the EU. And there's a complicated fight because the Russians are saying if you sign up with the EU, that's going to cost your trade status with us, which might be worth it, but it sure is at least going to be a transition period, right? But then the West is saying we're only going to loan you a little bit of money, barely enough to roll over your debts and pay your interest on your debt from last year and your previous loans and whatever, just barely enough. And we're demanding massive austerity, meaning you have to slash your pension programs for your elderly and your poor. It's a very poor country anyway. You have to slash your subsidies on fuel. You have to, essentially dismantle your welfare state for your poor and start turning over. This is the American empire, the economic hitman empire at play. You have to start turning over your wheat fields over to Archer Daniels Midland and Cargill and Monsanto, the American-based agribusiness firms, and you're going to turn over your oil resources to our buddies at Chevron and all this kind of stuff, which is a hell of a lot to ask. Meanwhile, Putin's saying, look, don't go with them. Stay with me, and I'll give you $5 billion to start. And while at the same time saying, if you don't, then you're going to have a hard time with your trade with Russia and a hell of a hard transition to the EU. And so it's important to point that out, not because I'm sitting here spinning for the Russian side of the story. I'm just explaining that it was the West that botched the negotiations, and a great authoritative source for that would be Henry Kissinger himself. He told The Guardian that this was all Angela Merkel's fault, the Chancellor of Germany, that She thought she's smart and good at making deals, but she's not. And she drove too hard of a bargain. And so Yanukovych balked and refused to sign. That's when the Maidan revolution began. The day that that happened, that he announced that he was at least postponing it, which they all knew meant the deal's off. When he said that, a guy from a George Soros-backed media organization, whose name I haven't figured out how to pronounce yet because I'm not that far into the audiobook yet. I'm going to totally botch this, but I don't care. Hamdratsky TV, something like that. Total like sock puppetry for an AstroTurf organization, right? It'd be like if RT tried to change their name to just another American media company. Yeah, no, you're clearly not that, right?
Right.
So it's that. And the leader of that is the one who went on Facebook and said, come on, everybody, let's all go down to the Maidan and start a big protest. And then it's just like the Orange Revolution before. We have tens or even hundreds of millions of dollars coming in from, and yes, I don't mind saying I got the footnotes in the book. Everybody can read great journalism. It's no kookery whatsoever. It's great journalism on the subject. Yes, including CIA and MI6 helping run the groundwork in the background behind the scenes in ways that mostly we can't describe, but we do have some good journalism about. But what we can see on the surface of the iceberg is plenty. It's the National Endowment for Democracy, the International Republican Institute, the National Democratic Institute, and a legion of Soros-backed groups and other think tanks equivalent from the Western European allies. And they just poured tens or hundreds of millions of dollars in. And so what they did for all through the winter, the bitter cold winter of all through December, because this really started the very end of November. So all through December, January, and February, they've got heat. They've got food, warm food, hot food. They've got places to sleep. They've got, they brought in these polystyrene foam beds to lay on that are really great insulators from the cold. So you sleep on the cold ground on this sort of rubber board that'll really kind of keep you warm, or, not transfer the cold straight up into your ass while you're sleeping anyway. And all of this stuff, tents and all of the things, and a giant stage, endless rock concerts, giant screens to play movies and propaganda and just keep everybody there. Buses to bring people from all around the western part of the country, all to bring anyone. And look, it's like the best job in town for a lot of people to, get a little bit of money to get on a bus and come and join the protest. And by the way, it's not to sell them short because it's a very divided country. And there are people, especially in the western part of the country, who very much want to be out from under Russia's shadow and influence as soon as possible, as fast as possible. But it's the furthest thing from unanimity in the country. It's very divided on that question, was very divided at the time. So when they say, oh, it's a popular revolution. Okay, so like if the Pussy Hats had taken over after Trump in a big color-coded revolution and overthrown him, and you would say, okay, it's a popular revolution. And we all know that, well, yeah, the Democrats represent, roughly a third of Americans, just like the Republicans do. So you can say, oh, it's a popular revolution, but 2/3 of the people didn't support it at all. You know what I mean? And probably half of them or more were really against it, but they weren't the ones out in the street, participating in the carnival and not organized enough to try to do anything about it. And you have, this is not, I am as libertarian as can be, as anti-government as can be. So if you are also like that, then you're like, okay, that's fine with me, Scott Horton. But some people might be like, no, you're so libertarian, I can't accept your libertarian take on it, or what, you know what I mean?
Right.
But the book is written by a libertarian. It's not written from libertarian sources any more than it's written from Russian sources or their point of view at all. I essentially am citing our own establishment, our own government and foreign policy establishment and media establishments own work against them, right? I'm just showing you every time that they admit I'm right against interest. And you can call it confirmation bias if you want, but you know what? Get back to me after you're done reading it and see if that's just confirmation bias or if I'm just righter in hell. And there they say that, oh, I guess Horton is right about this and right about this and right about this, because that's what I'm citing. I did a quick, control F for NYT.com or NYTimes.com in my footnotes. And it's like 800 or 500 something And there's, hundreds and hundreds of citations of the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the Economist, the Telegraph, the Times of London, and all of your, the LA Times, whatever kind of credible sources you need to be able to stand on. That's who I'm citing for you, is good journalism. It's not all like a bunch. And frankly, as long-winded as I am, I don't usually have a lot of philosophical stuff to say
Sure.
or write, or a bunch of like opinions. I don't think there's probably hardly any pages in the book, other than because of one big block quote or something. There's probably hardly any pages in the book at all that don't have a mess of citations at the bottom, because I'm really not talking to you in the book. I'm really just showing you my note
Right.
cards. I really am just saying, look, I did this giant research project, and here's what I found. And I was actually happy to see Amazon review. It was a positive review that said this is really more of a research project than a written work. And I'm like, I'll take that. Like,
Yeah.
he didn't mean it. He meant it in a neutral way.
Correct. Yeah.
Like he was like admitting that there's a little less storytelling and a little more just showing you throughout the book. But then look, it's 477,000 words of me just showing you. So what can I say? It's already too long anyway without me bloviating anything. I'm really just saying, look, the war party essentially portrays it like this, but here's why you should understand it my way instead. That's what I do, and I link to all of their claims and their works. You can check my facts about what I claim, they claim. I show all of my work there too. So, hopefully people can see whether I'm being fair to the people that I'm arguing against and the way that I'm portraying their argument as I take it on. But that's what I try to do.
You know what? It makes me think of like the point you're just making there. I'm going to go off on a little tangent, but I think you'll see how it's connected, right? There's so many things that the truth is just out there that you could find in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, from a Victoria Nuland speech. Like it's literally there. The problem is, like, I do home health care 70 hours a week. 99% of the people I know, they just don't really give a shit about government. They just like, hey, I want to go to work. I want to hang out with my family, want to hang out with my friends. And it's amazing to me how if you start to look into things, even just scratching the surface level, you'll see things that are just blatant truths. Like, let me give you one little example. Anytime you mention the name George Soros, people are like, conspiracy theories, this is just nonsense. But it's certainly confirmed that George Soros, both before the revolution and after, had many organizations that he was financing in Ukraine. One of them was called the Anti-Corruption Action Center, I think's the name of it. And you see this woman from it. She's all over the place talking about the corruption of prosecutors that were this guy Victor Shokin, that was fired by Biden at this quid pro quo, etc. Not to get into it too much, but you hear this woman all the time from the Anti-Corruption Action Center. It's like, well, who is this organization? And it turns out they're getting a bunch of money from George Soros. That I was able to find quite easily. But then there was this assertion I read somewhere, and I was like, wait, what? That said that actually these cutouts from the United States were also financing them. And I believe it was John Solomon's reporting said that the State Department of the United States specifically contacted their counterparts in Ukraine and was like, look, we don't want you to prosecute any people from this organization because we're giving them money. And if you think they did something wrong, we assure you it's probably just a misunderstanding. And this guy,
I didn't know that. That's interesting.
Check it out. This guy testified in the first impeachment of Trump. His name was George Kent. And he said, no, the original assertions that there was a do not prosecute list is untrue. And yet you could find John Solomon showed the document straight from the U.S. State Department signed by George Kent. Hey, I think there's a misunderstanding.
I should have had that.
It's now this is after that, but what it shows is, and the Obama team, they helped create what was called the NABU, which is sort of the FBI of Ukraine. And it's like this, look, we'll finance all your stuff. We'll help your law enforcement. But like you're saying, it's going to come with some big asks. Just like, and for me, who's a novice, I'm nowhere near the level of you. It sounds similar to like Afghanistan or similar to Iraq or similar to Libya, where these great Western liberators come in, but there's going to be a price. Right? Yeah. You can't have a gold dinar. You're going to have to be backed by the U.S. Western banking system. You're going to have to give a lot of your land and your crops and your resources over. And the story seems, I actually feel terrible for the people of Ukraine because I feel like on one hand, they have this Russian regime, which I have no love for, that they're living under the shadow. And the only option out of it's, well, to live under the shadow of the United States regime.
Right.
You know,
and what you're describing there, they call it shared sovereignty, meaning, imperialism. like neo colonialism, whatever, dude. You can call it
Yeah.
what you want. It's the world superpower pwning their entire ass, taking over their country. And I cite in the book Victoria Nuland boasting to Congress that we have just riddled their entire government with American government employees.
Yep.
We run their entire Justice Department and everything else. And it's really incredible to see. But I'm sorry because I ramble so much and go off on so many different tangents in different directions. I hope I didn't just drive everybody up the wall there.
No.
But let me pick back up with the beginning of the protest movement. Wait, no, let me first address the Soros point that you made too. There's a lot of Soros in my book, based mostly, and I have a lot of different stuff, but I want to give credit here to Mark McKinnon, who is a journalist from the Toronto Global, the Toronto Globe and Mail.
Okay.
That's what it is, Globe and Mail. And he wrote a book called The New Cold War. And he is the planet's foremost chronicler of the color-coded revolutions. You'll love the book. I mean, it is fantastic. And I am only like skittish that I quoted him too much. I hope he doesn't get mad that I just cite him so much in the book. He did a magnificent job on this thing. And he is very sympathetic to the color-coded revolutions. He's saying, look, in many cases, the Western chosen leaders are less worse than the Eastern chosen ones. And he's very sympathetic with a lot of the protesters who he's like covering in real life and are very real to him and clearly have their wishes, that he honors in his own way. And yet there's just no question about what's going on here. This is what's going on here. It's just straight news reporting. There's no bias in it. And in fact, a lot of people say, oh, it's anti-Semitism that would lead people to criticize George Soros. But in fact, McKinnon himself seems to like falsely attribute criticism of some of the worst Russian gangsters to anti-Semitism rather than the fact that they're some of the worst Russian gangsters. So in other words, he's the type to maybe use that accusation too loosely.
Right.
He certainly is not the type to say something anti-Semitic about George Soros or to be motivated by anti-Semitism to say something about George Soros. He's a perfectly decent guy, Mark McKinnon, a perfectly decent journalist from a major paper. He doesn't mean any harm like that. And in fact, by the way, I think this is very important. The modern hate Soros movement is really some pro-Israeli astroturf.
Right.
Because as Jewish as he may be, he is not a Zionist, and he's certainly not some right-wing Likudnik who wants to see Israel conquer all of the West Bank and Gaza Strip and all of this horror show. He's never been like that. And so it's American far right-wing Zionist Jews, essentially, who have built this, Josh Hammer and people like this, who are building this sort of astroturf hate Soros movement. Oh, by the way, he's done plenty to earn hate, especially by supporting prosecutors who are soft on violent felons of all things. Like, doesn't everyone want them to legalize victimless crimes and lift all the fines and fees for offenses against state edicts where you didn't really do anything to anyone? We all want that. What do? They double on all that stuff, but then they release violent felons. These progressives are just crazy. And damn Soros for doing that. And he learned a lot he earned a lot of direct heat for doing that real stuff. On the other hand, there's also a bunch of Likudniks who demonize him because he's more reasonable on Israel.
Well, and it's just real quick, I'll just say it's one of those things, and you see it with the establishment all the time, where they find, like, they'll take the most extreme version of a serious criticism, and then they use that to label everyone, right? So to make it real simple for people, if you're like, I don't think we should be funding Israel with Israel-Palestine, oh, so then you're an anti-Semite. Well, no, I didn't say that at all. I have no love for the Palestinian people or or Hamas. I just don't think we should be involved. It's the same with this. Like, anytime you make a legitimate criticism of, like, look, there's this organization that was backed by U.S. State Department dollars, cutouts, in Ukraine, and Soros was backing a lot of them too, and they have an agenda, You could agree with that agenda or not, and there's problems with that from the perspective of how certain people look at it, and they're just like, oh, you said George Soros, ha ha ha. And to me, it's just laughable because it's the most intellectually dishonest thing to do. It's not that I completely believe you when you say it has nothing to do with anti-Semitism or even a personal dislike of George Soros. It's the idea that he is this outside wealthy billionaire who has a stake in reforming countries and a vision that he seeks to have them look like, and the problems that comes to that if the U.S. State Department's involved with that as well. Nothing to do with.
That's such an important point, man. Because listen, the world is lousy with billionaires. The United States is lousy with billionaires. Not all of them are political like this.
Right.
Right. This particular man this Hungarian American billionaire has staked out his claim as an international mover and shaker, not just in business, but in politics, big time, including when communism is still there. You know, people nowadays, they call him a Marxist and a communist. That's mostly name calling. What he actually is he's a center-left anti-communist Democrat. He is like a Harry Truman Democrat. Mm-hmm. He is not a left-wing Marxist. He hates communism. And that's his hatred for communism has lasted and turned into this enduring hatred of Russia as well. Even though communism is gone, he's still up to the same old thing against them. So that would be the better way to understand him. He's not a commie pinko. He's Hillary Clinton. And I'm sorry, because that's also not the way to understand Hillary Clinton.
Right.
Hillary Clinton is Bill Clinton. Is that clear? All right. The guy that burned Waco and expanded the empire. That guy, he's not a commie hippie liberal. He's a right-wing Democrat. One more click and he's George W. Bush. Right. And essentially that's that's the way to understand George Soros as well and his view. And by the way, like you can, and of course, I have all the citations in the book. I wouldn't go and make claims and not show you the work here. And you can see where, and anyone can Google this right now and pull it up in no time flat, is he did an interview in 1995 in the New Yorker magazine with a journalist named Connie Bruck, B-R-U-C-K, where he takes credit for rigging the Ukrainian election of 1994 for his buddy Kuchma. This is the guy who would now be considered the pro-Russian candidate against the Western one. But in this case, that was what George Soros wanted back in 1994. Then he was deeply involved in 2004, and then he's deeply involved again in 2014. I'm sorry, pal. It ain't my fault that he was there, and it ain't my fault that all these years end in 4, and none of this is because of me and because of anti-Semitism. This is just the history of the world since the end of the Cold War, and he played a major role in it, and he's happy to boast about it, and all of his colleagues in the State Department and the rest of the government are happy to describe the influence and the power that he has as sort of an adjunct of the U.S. State Department in accomplishing American goals, particularly in Europe and with the color-coded revolutions. So that's all just true, and I hope that people take it in its proper spirit. And so now, during this whole winter, essentially the leaders of the protest movement, the self-appointed leaders, are Arseny Yatsenyuk, who's from the Fatherland Party, which is close to Yulia Tymoshenko, the gas princess from Ukr-Nafta, is what it's called, or something like that, the major gas concern. They called her the gas princess, Yulia Tymoshenko. She's the one with the Princess Leia hair always with the braids. Used to be pretty, you know. Then there's Tanny Bach, and Tanny Bach was from the Svoboda Party, which used to be the Social Nationalists. And he's the guy where if you put his name in Google Images, you see him giving the Hitler salute with some SS lightning bolts behind him and stuff, because these guys are literally the descendants of those who served Hitler in the Second World War. Now, that's kind of a whole other story, but I give the whole backstory in the book for people interested in that. He's an extremely far right-wing guy. And then the other major leader was a guy named Klitschko, and there's two brothers, and this is Vitaly, I think this one is Vitaly Klitschko, and he later became the mayor, and he's a famous heavyweight boxer. Yep. And he was from the Udar Party, which I think is, essentially Ukrainian nationalist, but not nearly as far right as Tanny Bach, but he's like one of the big three leaders there. And so these three are sort of the mascots of the revolution, basically, and the leaders of the negotiations. But meanwhile, out there in the square, there's thousands of people and including, especially more and more as time goes on, far right-wing nationalist groups from especially the west of the country. And now, so let me disclaim to your audience here a little bit. I know everybody is sick and tired of hearing everybody on the right be called a Nazi. And especially right now, right? Like you could have Klansmen on horseback riding around a black man's house, and then someone would be like, oh my God, racists. And everybody else would be like, oh, shut up.
Yep.
You know what I mean? Because
Yep.
we're just so tired of hearing that word.
Yep.
We're so tired of hearing, oh, you're a Nazi. Oh, you're a fascist. I hope people understand I'm making a joke there with the thing. It would help the black guy. Anyway, but the point is people are just so tired of that. And I want to acknowledge that and then beg your forgiveness as I try your patience and say, these guys are Nazis, man. And I mean, their grandfathers served Hitler literally and helped him implement the Holocaust in the Second World War. And these are the same groups who last in different forms, and including some of the very same men and their sons and grandsons who lasted through the Cold War generations and were the ones who they came back from exile at the end of the Cold War, and they got a big boost with the Orange Revolution in 04 and a much bigger boost in 14. And they came out into the street. And let me rewind just a little bit to should be a touchstone for people. I think certainly my generation, I just heard of this when I was a kid plenty of times. I presume that this is kind of pop culture understanding for people who are interested at all in World War II would be that you've heard of this before. I know you have. When the Nazis came in the East, some people greeted them as liberators because they had been controlled by the Soviet Union, communists, in the lead up to that. And they hated living as slaves under communism so bad that when the German Nazis came, they said, hooray. And then, especially the way we always hear the story is, and then they later regretted it because, boy, the Nazis didn't care about them, only about themselves. And they were just in worse trouble. And of course, then the Soviets won the war. So anybody who sided with the Nazis when the Nazis came, boy, they were even worse trouble after that. Am I touchstoning on a touchstone?
Oh, yeah.
That you're people familiar with this?
Yep.
This is what happened. This is part of Ukraine's history from the war. They had suffered terribly under communism. Then some of them sided with the Nazis. And then the Nazis killed like 800,000 Jews in the Holocaust in Ukraine. Even before they really built the death camps, they're just rounding them up and shooting them and dropping them in pits and stuff for years over there. It was really ugly. And there were certain factions, especially in the far west of the country, who had participated in that and were groups. You know, it was part of that. You've also probably heard of like Operation Gladio in Western Europe and the Stay Behind programs. And that meant America backing right-wing groups across Europe, especially Western Europe is what's more familiar to people. In case the Soviets invaded Western Europe, we would have right-wing militias, stay behind militias, ready to launch an insurgency against them, right? Well, we also backed right-wing groups on the Soviet side of the line, such as in Ukraine. These same groups, the OUN, UPA, they were backed by the CIA and the U.S. Army, Special Intelligence Division, whatever the hell thing it was called, and backed them until 1959. In an insurgency against the Soviet Union there. And sort of in a corollary to what we're doing now, right? Just feeding these guys into a grinder, giving them enough backing to keep fighting, but never to win. What
Right.
They was dying. But then again, there are a bunch of Nazis anyway, so who cares? Not this time, but that time. This time there are some Nazis, but not that the whole Ukrainian army is. But those insurgent fighters were back then. But anyway, so these are the same kind of groups. And then at the end of the Cold War, and then there have been a bunch of exiles who were all connected with them that lived in the U.S. and Canada especially. And when the Cold War ended, they all went home and started to, bring this whole political culture back and to try to rewrite history to say, no, we fought the Nazis and the commies and we saved the Jews and all of this stuff, which was not true. But they tried to they don't have a George Washington. So they tried to make one out of this guy, Stepan Bandera, who was nothing but horrible,
Right.
Absolute fascist, and all of his guys. But they're like, well, that's the best they can do. They don't have any real heroes to make heroes out of. So at least mostly they try to lie about him and say he wasn't that bad. Sometimes they go, no, he killed lots of Jews. That was what was great about him. And then they're caught again. You know what I mean? But anyway, so these groups are important because they were a significant percentage of the groups on the street there, and they were the ones who finally accomplished the putsch on the February the 21st there. So what happened is people often call it a coup, and short for coup d'etat. And there's a coup d'etat and a coup de main and a coup de this and that. If you're a Frenchman, you know what all that stuff means. I know a coup de main is like when Saddam just rolls right into Kuwait and it's over, or when Putin has his sailors and Marines just stand outside and declare that Crimea belongs to them again. That's a coup de main.
Okay.
One big surprise attack or one big surprise move and over and done, right? A coup d'etat is when your chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff shoots you in the head and replaces you, right? That kind of thing, right? Okay. So this is what they call a putsch, P-U-S-T-C-H, which means a bunch of crazy right-wingers rioting in the street and you run like hell. Okay, that's my translation. And so that was what happened, was they tried to make a deal. The Americans and the Europeans and the Russians insisted, Vladimir Putin himself insisted, that Yanukovych sign this deal where he promised to hold early elections and to pull his police forces back as long as the rioters and the protesters would also pull their people back and their violent forces back, which is a stupid deal because there's only a few, but still no one really in charge out there, right? Like,
Right.
you can say, all right, it's not like Denzel Washington telling the Muslims, all right, about face, everybody march, right? Like, there's nobody,
Right.
that's not happening, right? So they don't go anywhere. And when the big three protest leaders announce the New Deal, the real Nazis run up there and say, forget that. And then one of them, his name is Parasyuk, and we know he admitted and bragged about it, and all different sources say he was the one leading the snipers from the music conservatory that morning. Same guy, leader of the 100, he said, runs up there and says, listen, we refuse to accept this. The deal is off. If the president doesn't leave by 10 o'clock in the morning, we're going to go there and kill him. I swear to God. And then the New York Times and everybody else goes, hey, this was a credible threat, man. They had the guns, and the other side, the police, didn't have the force. And then it's a little confusing. There's different reporting about exactly what happened, but seemingly the heads of the chiefs of the security forces just left town. Then the lower down guys were like, well, forget this. And they all got on buses and left too. So now all of downtown's wide open. They didn't just pull their police back from the Maidan. They just left the capital city, basically. And there are different versions of Yanukovych's flight. The immediate reporting was that he simply fled because he knew these guys were coming to kill him. And he just fled and left town. And I have no idea. I'm not saying this guy's exactly credible because he's a horrible guy.
Right.
But this is stupid enough that I kind of believe it. Just sounds kind of like what a government employee would do.
Yeah.
He said that Yanukovych had a previously scheduled meeting out of town. And he just left town to go to the meeting that morning, not recognizing that the body language there was of ultimate total surrender and capitulation and surrender of power. By leaving the capital city today, like this morning, you're leaving the capital city, really? And he up and left. So that's what Sikorsky says, the foreign minister of Poland. I don't know if that's really true, but that was at least one explanation for how he was he kind of half did it to himself there. I mean, certainly he screwed himself by agreeing to that stupid agreement that he couldn't enforce and made no real sense. And then as soon as he fled, John Kerry came and recognized the new government immediately as the legitimate government of the country, and all the other Western powers followed suit and the rest. So, and I'm sorry because I go so slow when I get bogged down in my details.
Perfectly fine. I love it.
So the way to understand now, listen, your audience has heard a million times that like, okay, you're right. This doesn't start yesterday. This doesn't start in 22. It starts in 14 when Putin seized Crimea. No. It was the revolution before that. So here's what led to the seizure of Crimea was first there was this weird bus attack where a bunch of Crimeans who had taken buses up to Kiev to do like a counter protest, they lost. So they got on their buses to try to go home, and they got intercepted by right sector, that some of the fascists at a roadblock who basically kicked their ass. I don't think they killed any of them, but they basically beat them up and threatened them and said, go home, you Russians, and all of this stuff. And so maybe one of them was killed or something. But anyway, so that was kind of a big public relations thing there. Problem in the Crimean
Right.
Peninsula and extra division there. But then the next thing was all of the former presidents, Kravchuk, Kuchma, uh, Yushchenko, all wrote a letter, and Yushchenko all wrote a joint letter saying now is the time to cancel the Kharkiv Pact and kick Russia out of the Sevastopol naval base on the Crimean Peninsula. And it was only then, and I guess I'll stop and say, well, there's a whole complicated history behind it, but just understand that it's an extremely important naval base to the Russians. It's belonged to them since Catherine the Great in the days before our Constitution was even ratified in the 1780s. And anyone could have told you that they'll be damned before they give it up. They're just not going to. And so they said, now let's kick the Russians out of that naval base. And only then, Putin says he planned on doing it before. Maybe he did, but it was on the timeline. It was only after that that he ordered his sailors and Marines to go stand outside with their rifles. As I learned as a young man from a guy who was in the Marine Corps Force Recon, you don't own anything until your guy is standing on the corner with a rifle. Well, that was what they did. They stood around with rifles. It was theirs. And so that was the big coup de main. Only 4 people were killed, tragically. But anyway, that was essentially that. But see, then it caused a real problem because, I should mention, they held amounts to a phony plebiscite simply because of the power shift on the ground in reality. I think the numbers were actually pretty accurate, honestly. Pew and Gallup, among others, verified the numbers later. So maybe it was a little bit high, but essentially there was something like a supermajority of Crimeans voted on a nebulously worded thing that said, well, we're going to seek independence. Then they changed it at the end to we're going to join with Russia. They got certainly, and look, that's not exactly fair to the minority that didn't want to change sovereignty, but I mean, what are you going to do? It's a giant piece of land, and the question is which sovereignty controls it. You have a super majority wants to change. It might be worse to make them stay in the old sovereignty, right? Like you can debate about this, but it's not so cut and dry for Ukraine's side, that's for sure. And in the book, I won't waste your time, but in the book, I go through the history of Russian control of the peninsula and that naval base, and especially all of the different controversies since Ukrainian independence from the Soviet Union at the fall of the Soviet Union at the end of 1991. And I take you all the way through all the different controversies over just how much control Ukraine has over the peninsula and how much control Russia has over that, to them, extremely important naval base there. So, but now once that happened, now the new junta in Kiev, backed by the United States, they kind of panic. And when the eastern portions of the country, protesters come out and start seizing government buildings there and refusing to recognize the authority of the new regime that had overthrown their elected president, then America, in the form of Barack Obama, sent John Brennan, who you already know is the leader of al-Qaeda in Syria in those days, and the guy who framed Trump for treason in Russiagate later. He sent Brennan over there to instruct them to launch a war, to launch a civil war. And at the time, and look, there were Russians who were like spies or, agents or deniable kind of operatives who were helping to lead some of this stuff. Well, mostly they were late to the party. This was essentially a domestic thing, just like the Americans. Boy, you talk about the level of influence the West put in on the side of the Maidan Revolution. It makes this stuff pale in comparison by a million times as far as Russian influence with the protesters in the East. But so far, there have been no acts of war. All they had done, the worst thing that they had done was seize the intelligence building, the SVB intelligence headquarters. But they didn't kill anyone when they seized it. They just kind of took it over, right? But Barack Obama and John Brennan said, go to war. And they launched a civil war. And then, of course, what happened? That just made everything worse. That just drove more people into the dissenters' hands. Half the military dissented and split and went to the other side. And then what'd they do? They went and recruited the Nazis
Yep.
and sent the Nazis to go fight because they didn't have enough soldiers yet. So they needed a bunch of Hitler-loving Nazis to go and do their dirty work in the meantime, which of course meant horrific war crimes and the rest, because that's who they are and that's how they behave. And so that was the start of the war. And in that first year, from say, April 2014 through February 2015, something like 9,000 people were killed in the first year of the war there on both sides. Then they finally had the Minsk II deal by February of 15. That changed it into what they call low-level fighting, where they pulled back the heavier armaments. They ceased the airstrikes and toned the war down. So now you only have hundreds of people being killed every year instead of thousands and thousands every year. But it amounted to another about 4,000 people over the next 7 years in the lead up to the War of 22. And now look, man, I have to say here, and forgive me because I do a lot of interviews. If I already said this a minute ago, then just stop me. But I don't think I did. But I think it's important because I have to assume in a charitable way, not to be a jerk about it, but like in an honest way, there have to be people listening to me now who are just saying to themselves, there's no way anyone could be this convincing about the other side of the story unless they were on the other side telling that story. But that's just not right, okay? I'm a Texan. And like, quite frankly, Texas is really big. I'm a Central Texan. Like, that's my home country, right? Like, I'm sorry.
Right.
I'm an American. I'm a Texas and an American patriot, but I'm not an Eastern European patriot, not Ukraine or Russia. I couldn't possibly be. I'm from here, and my interests are purely parochial. I'm like a Ron Paul.
Yep.
And more, maybe I'm more of a Pat Buchanan. I'm like Republic, not Empire guy here. So none of this has to do with accusing America. And it has everything to do with accusing the Bushes and the Clintons, McCain and Biden of screwing us all, of being horrible on everything. If you're so partisan that you can't stand to hear a word said against the Bushes or something, well, then I cry for you. But like, these people, John McCain, this is the worst American who ever lived, probably. Thank God he never obtained the presidency. And I don't know any conservatives who ever loved him. Conservatives always hated him. He's horrible on everything. Why do the media love him? Oh, he's a maverick. What does that mean? It means he's a damn Democrat.
Right.
In the very worst fashion, the very worst kind of, again, like a George Soros, all the way to the right, but still a Democrat as you could be. Democrat, center-right, anti-communist, interventionist, Democrat. And yet the Soviet Union's gone. We made friends with the Chi-Coms back in the early 70s. The Soviet Union completely ceased to exist. Russian communism hadn't been around at all since Christmas Day 1991. And so what use do we got for anti-communism now other than trying to keep them out of our kids' schools and whatever, right? Like, this has nothing to do with foreign policy. Putin's not a communist. Putin is what? Think about where he fits on the political spectrum. He's a center-right conservative. Right? He's not a fascist or a Nazi. He's at war, but hey, American Republicans go to war a lot too.
Yep.
He's not a fascist. And look, there are ethnic nationalists in Russia. There absolutely are. He purely establishes himself as a believer in multi-ethnic democracy in Russia. Now, look, he's a strong man, been in power for 25 years. I'm no fool, and I'm not asking you to be, but I'm saying, as far as, democracy, regular elections, and change of power, he's a very strong man. He's not exactly a dictator. And what he is certainly not is an ethnic Russian chauvinist at the expense of other ethnicities or religious sects or whoever in his country, in terms of Muslims or Jews or whoever who don't fit as just classic ethnic Russian Orthodox Christians. He is absolutely not a far right winger on those issues at all. And the Russian Nazis who are like that, they're horrific. They behead people and commit horrific acts of terrorism. They're like the worst kinds of Nazis that you would ever have in American history here. And he kicks their ass and locks them in prison. What's he supposed to do? He's not one of them. He's not like that at all. That's what people say.
They rewrite history. Like Navalny, right? Who was he jailed? He's like actually said a lot of stuff that the left would be furious about, right? Like racial stuff,
And he is, and in fact, I'm so grateful that you brought that up. This is the Americans' idea. This is Hillary Clinton's idea of how to fix Russia, is to back a guy like Alexei Navalny, who, as you absolutely correctly identify him, is far to the right of Putin is an absolute ethnic Russian nationalist. What Americans, certainly anyone on the left would say without any irony whatsoever, is a Nazi, a fascist. Like, I'm not saying he's all the way a fascist, but he's certainly an ethnic nationalist, and like, those lines get pretty blurry when you get that far to the right, man. And the Americans' idea was we'll give him a bunch of money, or at least we'll give the liberals a bunch of money to run around with him and hold a big protest, because the liberal protest isn't big enough and a right-wing nationalist protest isn't big enough. But maybe if we pour some money in there, we can bring them together and hold a protest that's big enough to what? To drive Putin crazy? To make him absolutely hate your guts and swear revenge? Because you're not going to accomplish anything better than that. And I'm talking to Hillary Clinton here.
Right.
This is the snow revolution of 2011. Her and Michael McFaul messing around over there. What kind of flavor crack are they smoking? They're not going to get away with a color revolution in Moscow. Have you ever seen the size of that red brick wall they keep around the Kremlin?
Yep.
You're not getting away with 1917. Are you insane? So then what's the point, right? It's like me coming up to you and smacking you in the face a few times. Like, wait a minute, where is the profit in this, Scott? Because, like, this guy's about to fight you. Like, how much longer are we going to go on before this starts getting contrary to your interests here, you know?
And
It's
that's what
insane to do this.
I think you make a great point, right? Where, because I come from basically the same position as you. I was in the debate circuit when I was like in my 20s in 2003, 2004. I was a Ron Paul guy. So all these debate people were super lefties, and they thought like my libertarian-esque economics was like nonsensical, but at least I was against the war. I was against the Iraq war, so they could deal with me there, right? And that's sort of where I've been. I'm tired of us being involved in these things over and over. One of the debates I have with people all the time is, I'm willing for someone to just be an American chauvinist and say, I don't give a shit if we exploit other countries, so be it. I'm open to hearing that argument. The problem I have is this. There are two different arguments going on. There is, should the United States be the hegemon? Is the world better off with like a world police superpower hegemon? Like in theory. And secondly, in practice, with the people that are currently running our military and intelligence, are they people that we trust with that? And I think the answer is a resounding no, not just with incompetence, but with corruption. Like, for example, the story I tell people all the time, and again, I'm just a normal guy. If you look at our situation in Syria, which I think has a lot to do with Russia's distrust of the United States, we're told that we need to perpetually be in Syria to fight ISIS, which means we have to partner with Al-Qaeda and al-Nusra, which back home we're told we have to violate our Fourth Amendment rights because these groups are so bad. But we have to stay in Syria perpetually because if we leave, our ally, the Turks, where we station nuclear weapons, will commit genocide against our allies, the Kurds. So we have to, because we've given nuclear weapons to Turkey and we're honor bound to defend them, we can't leave another foreign country where we're violating their sovereignty because our allies will commit genocide against our other allies. Oh, but Russia doesn't have the right to be pissed about that, and neither does Assad. This is just one surface level of our foreign policy. You could do the same story in Libya. And so for me, my answer to all of this as someone who doesn't have time to like delve into this is to say like, look, there's a lot of shitty situations. There's strongmen leaders. There's ethnic rivalries. There's historical conflicts that have gone back 2,000 years. The United States needs to stay out of it. We should not be funding Russia or Ukraine in this situation. And what we're doing is creating a meat grinder as far as I'm concerned. And I have a friend who I stream with a lot who's been stationed in Ukraine for over a year now. He loves the Ukrainian people. I'm sympathetic to him. And I'm like, let me tell you how the story ends. The people of Ukraine get screwed over at the end. Just like the people of Libya, just like the people of Afghanistan. They're the ones that are going to die. People in the United States are going to pay. Average people like me that can't afford their groceries anymore, they're going to be told to sacrifice more while their government enriches themselves and their allies across the world. And the only people that win are military-industrial complex people, the politicians in this country, and hell, I think even politicians in Russia will end up better off for this because they'll entrench power more, and they're going to end up getting some sort of political victory for this at the end. And so that's the story. Like, it's so hard, though, because the propaganda is so easy that just Russia are just these horrible, grotesque, evil people running that country, and they're the bad guys, and Ukraine, Zelensky's, like Lord of the Rings, he's Aragorn, and he's fighting this noble battle. And so...
You know what, though? I guess about a year ago or a year and a half ago, a guy on Twitter said to me, he goes, man, you need to change the subtitle of your book. Because I already like claiming dibs. I was terrified someone's going to publish a book called
Yeah.
Provoked before I could get mine done because it's such an obvious and awesome
Great.
title
Yeah.
for a book about this, right? So I was talking about it, and the guy said, "No, you got to change the subtitle because the subtitle was how America started the new Cold War with Russia and the catastrophe in Ukraine." And he said, "No, no, no, change America to Washington." Because
Right.
people are going to misunderstand what you mean by that. But we
Right.
know what you mean by Washington. That's just short code for the U.S. federal government and its elected president, supposedly elected president, whoever that is. We know what that means. And it's even kind of weird because it's like, it's not parallel. It's not how they started the new Cold War with Moscow, because that doesn't quite sound right either.
Right.
So I had to leave it how Washington, the city, started the new Cold War with Russia, the country, even though, whatever. But even though that's a little clumsy in its own right that way with the asymmetry there, it's still important to say that, like, look, man, as it should ring in your ear, Washington ain't America.
Right.
Washington's just Washington. And like to even narrow it down further, the Bushes and Clintons and McCain and Biden, they're not America either. Even if somehow Lindsey Graham, I don't know how, was able by hook and crook and corruption and payoffs to get elected to the U.S. Senate in South Carolina over and over and over again. I'm sorry. I just can never do enough drugs to make me believe in popular sovereignty enough to believe that Lindsey Graham then therefore somehow is the expression of America
Correct.
itself, is America, and that his preferences are what America wants. That's not right. It just doesn't stick. America is a gigantic place full of 350 million people, and I happen to be quite fond of it.
Right.
And that's why I hate our national government so much, because they clearly are the greatest threat to our life and liberty. So I hope people can take it in the proper spirit that, Bill Clinton, Jeffrey Epstein's friend, who beat the crap out of Juanita Broderick and savagely bit her on the face as he raped her. Yeah, well, that guy also made bad decisions in regards to his Middle Eastern and Eastern
Who would've
European
thought,
policy.
right?
Are you with me? Like, that's all we're talking about here. George Bush, who possibly people in your audience think of him as at least a decent guy. He didn't mistreat his wife the way Bill Clinton did. You know what I mean? He has some honor on at least a personal basis, right? He's friendly to his butler, unlike Hillary, the devil, right? But come on, he was really unwise, right?
Yep.
I won't even call him stupid. How about he was very unwise?
Well, let me real quick.
Terrible choices a lot of the times.
Real quick, let me ask you about the most interesting part of the Tucker interview with Putin was when Putin said that he at one point had this conversation with Obama where he was like, I would be interested in coming on with like the EU or NATO. I would sort of be interested in becoming more friendly. And he claimed to Tucker that Obama seemed open to it. But basically, once he got back and talked to his handlers, they were like, no. Do you see some truth in that maybe some people like Bush, even Obama, or maybe even Clinton, that at the end of the day, it's like Washington gonna Washington. It don't matter what some individual president wants to do. These people that are really running the show behind the scenes, they don't want that sort of relationship. They like the conflict.
Yeah. Well, I cannot verify that anecdote from any American sources that I've ever heard of, that particular one. But yes, overall, it can be extremely difficult, even for a president like W. Bush, who, I'm not sure exactly what all of Washington thought of him, but it didn't really matter because of the power that Dick Cheney had. He was sophisticated enough of an operator in Washington that he ensconced, especially the neoconservative faction, in proper positions that what he said went. They were able to really do what they wanted in a lot of ways. On the other hand, were there places where, certainly later, mostly for the good, there were places where the establishment, the permanent government resisted him. Like, for example, he really wanted to gin up an excuse to attack Iran in 2007, and the CIA debunked him and said they're not making nuclear weapons. There goes your pretext for a war, pal, and undermined him in that case. In the case of Donald Trump, there's a great statement in the New York Times Magazine, in this great piece by Keith Gesson about the quiet Russia hands, the quiet Americans, the Russia hands who do our Russia policy. And they say in there about Trump and regarding him being hamstrung by Russiagate especially, they say, well, so the president's like the captain of a ship, and he's got his hands on the wheel, but it's not connected to anything. Right. And so there's the Congress's policy, and there's the executive branch's policy, and there's the president's policy. But the president's policy doesn't really affect the executive branch's policy. And back to what you said about, to connect to sort of where we started here with Ukraine Gate. Look at what happened with Ukraine Gate, where the germ of it was a guy named Alexander Vindman, who's a foreign national, somehow posing as a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army. I don't know how in the world that happened. Him and his twin brother, I don't know his twin brother's rank. His twin brother is now in the U.S. House, if you can believe that crap. Or it's going to be. But so this guy, he said that Donald Trump had clearly crossed the brightest red line in the way that he handled this so-called perfect phone call between Trump and Zelensky, and severely implying and pretending to believe that Trump had outright extorted Zelensky and said, I demand that you launch a criminal investigation into a man who I hereby claim to agree with the world is innocent of any crime, just to hurt him for my political career, and in exchange I'll get you missiles. Well, that's not what the phone call said at all, but that was the way Vindman spun it, and then he gave it to this guy Eric Ciaramella, who was
Are you allowed to say his name now?
Yeah, right. I hope I don't get you kicked off of YouTube. So he had been on the National Security Council with Vindman, but it got kicked off for leaking against Trump and had gone back to CIA. Not fired, didn't have to go get a real job, but just had to go back to CIA. So Vindman leaks to him, and he's the one who issues the whistleblower complaint, and that's what kicks off the whole Ukraine Gate thing. But here's the important point that I want to emphasize, and I'd really like to ask your audience to verify this. Follow up on this, because I'll be happy and excited knowing the emotions that you're going to go through when you read this stuff yourself with your own eyeballs, and don't take my word for it. Let's go back. You probably watched the YouTube of the thing. But certainly you can read his testimony, Vindman that is, and his article in the Atlantic magazine that he wrote all about it as well. And I'm pretty tightly paraphrasing him here, where he says repeatedly that Donald Trump, the president of the United States of America, was trying to change our Russia policy. He was trying to change our Ukraine policy.
Yep.
Our Ukraine policy, meaning Lieutenant Colonel Vindman's Ukraine policy. Him and the Deputies Committee of the National Security Council, the interagency. That's where the third-ranking guys meet to coordinate what the bosses of the different agencies have decided under the direction of the President of the United States. Well, here, Lieutenant Colonel Vindman says repeatedly the president had no right to do this. How dare Donald Trump change? Let me tell you something. Me and all of the guys at the interagency, we had already worked out what America's Ukraine and Russia policy was. Now, who the hell does this guy think he is, this guy Trump, think he is to change it? We had to stop him. And then the obvious and almost like mumbled, not quite unspoken end of the statement is, therefore I trumped up this crap about the phone call. Right? That's the whole point. You can read him in his own words. He says our foreign policy. He's not talking about America. He's talking about him and his friends 3 or 4 ranks down in the executive branch dictating to the president of the United States. They can't believe that he thinks for a minute he has the authority to tell them what to do. They're the U.S. government. Who the hell is he?
Yep. Yeah. It wasn't just, by the way, he's the most significant of it. But I think there was this woman from the State Department that testified, Yovanovitch was maybe her name. She kept saying our foreign policy, our Ukrainian policy. And I said during the impeachment, I was live streaming, I was like, look at the arrogance. The State Department feels like Donald Trump came in and they were like, can you believe this guy's stepping on our toes? Like he needs to shut up. It's surreal. I know your time's precious. I could talk to you for 8 hours. So I just wanted to give one final chance here to shout out your book. So again, my guest today, Scott Horton, wrote Provoked, How Washington Started the New Cold War with Russia and the Catastrophe in Ukraine. Can you tell us the best place to find your book, and maybe if you got any more interviews or debate coming up that people could tune in for the next week or so?
Yeah, sure. So it's just at Amazon, and the Kindle version is there as well. They're not linked together because I had to make one slight change and they got unlinked, but you can, the Kindle is there if you look, if you're a Kindle guy. if you stop by my website, scotthorton.org first, then that's my custom link. I'll get an extra little kickback from that probably. Or the pinned tweet on at Scott Horton Show on X there. The top pinned tweet, if you follow that link, I'll probably get an extra little kickback from Amazon side of the sale there. But otherwise, I'm perfectly happy if people just go to Amazon and get it. And very proud to say that Ron Paul and John Mearsheimer and Judge Napolitano and a lot of other greats said that it was not bad. So, awesome. So that's pretty good. And then, I have a show at scotthorton.org. I got 6,000 interviews going back to 1999. Really just one from 99. The rest are from 2003 on. That's all at scotthorton.org, 6,000 something of them. And then I'm at the Libertarian Institute. I'm the director of the Institute, and I've got an incredible team of guys and a couple of gals that just do really great work on the blog and their articles and a bunch of really great podcasts, especially on foreign policy, but also on everything else too. And it's really great stuff. That's at libertarianinstitute.org. And I won't burden you with any more. I'm at Scott Horton Show on Twitter, guys.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. Hopefully we'll talk soon. And I can't wait to see you dunk on more of these fools like you were on Piers Morgan there the other day. It's always enjoyable.
Thank you, man.
All right, man. You have a good one. Thanks so much.